Everybody has their belly full? Yes? No food insecurity? Great. All right, so we have an exciting session coming up on the demand for, and I'm dropping one word, and the impact of land titling in Africa. Actually, we're going to take a bit of a funnel. We're going to start with the globe. We're going to go to Africa and then to two country cases. So we are going to kind of go from the micro to the micro. We're having with us Eduardo Montero, assistant professor at Chicago, Matthew Ribar, who's a PhD candidate at Stanford, Pablo Balan, who's assistant professor at Tel Aviv, and Daniel, our own Daniel Ali from RG, known each other for 100 years without exaggerating. I think what's interesting about this session is to understand a little bit of kind of the institutions behind the structures of land and land use, and understanding a little more about the historical factors that determine land arrangements and what impact that might have on our efforts to increase land titling. We then move, and that's Eduardo. We'll move to Matthew on thinking about and innovating on the data side of things, and bringing in some understanding of whether or not the valuation of rural land has an impact on the demand for titling. And then down, moving to Pablo on an interesting RCTs of land titling in the DRC. They don't talk about that a lot in the paper, but it has quite a bit of an impact on both the demand and the resulting titling of land. But the paper focuses more on understanding the relationship between property rights, or the demand for these property rights, and other institutions, horizontal and vertical institutions, which they call social institutions, things like belonging to churches and other horizontal institutions, as well as vertical institutions participating in kind of more political types, for example, relationship with village chiefs and so forth and so on. That's an interesting little take on the complementarities and substitutability of different institutions. We then go to Daniel and Klaus's work, looking at 20 years of historical data from Lesotho, and again, trying to understand in this now in an urban environment, whether or not the titling has an impact on land and mortgage markets. So it should be a nice ride. Looking forward to hearing from all of you. We'll start with Eduardo on, we're already in the introduction. I must have clicked your slide. I'm so sorry. All right.
Ready to start.
Please, thank you.
So thank you guys very much for the invitation. Very excited to present this work to you guys and get your guys' comments and thoughts. The project's on fallow lengths and the structure of property rights. And so what got us interested in this topic is that I think a lot of people in this room, in this conference, it's really fantastic, would probably agree that a very fundamental institution in many societies is the structure of property rights over land. So how are decisions made over land? In many Western societies, I think we tend to see that private property rights are the predominant way of organizing land rights, and I think that's often led to policies that kind of use a very Western way of thinking about land. But when we zoom out across the world, many societies actually don't develop private property rights, and instead, many societies have communal property rights. So to motivate this is just data put together by anthropologists from the standard cross-cultural sample. So it's put together using reports from different anthropologists about societies in the mid-1900s. And they have a variable on how communal is land, whether it's predominantly private, partially communally used, or communal only. And as you can see, private rights are actually the minority across societies historically. In fact, most societies tended to have some form of communal land rights. And so this kind of goes against this notion that private property rights are like the main way to organize land. In fact, communal rights are very common, and they tend to be common today in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Latin America, and parts of South Asia. And so what got us interested in studying two things, which is one, why do some societies develop private rights over communal rights or vice versa? So what determines whether a society had communal rights over private rights, just given the variation we see across the world? And then if we can understand a little bit about the origins, then we're going to ask a little bit about what are the consequences for the way we design policies moving forward. How do we tailor policies for places where land was organized more communally than private? To kind of set terms so that we're all on the same page, what do I mean kind of very broadly when I'm thinking about kind of private rights versus communal rights? We're going to be talking about land rights specifically, more in rural areas, so not urban areas. Land rights are just a bundle of many different rights regarding the access, so who gets to access land, the use, who gets to use it and for what purposes, and how does transfer of land work. So land rights encompass many different things. When we think about private property rights, we mean all land rights for a given plot are held by either a sole individual or a nuclear household. So that's kind of the way we think about it in Western countries. For communal property rights, this is a spectrum where several or all of these land rights are held by a community. What is a community? That can vary across places. It's just a collective group of people, but often that means things like clans. So in DRC, you often see clans, villages where there's a village chief making the decisions about allocating land, or even ethnic groups. But one thing I want to emphasize, I think everyone in this room knows this, but it's important sometimes to clarify this, is that communal property rights are not the same thing as communal production. Actually, in most places where you see communal property rights, individuals have individual exclusive rights to the land they're cultivating, so they're producing kind of almost at the individual level. But what happens is once the land is no longer in use or in fallow, then the community can decide to reallocate it. And so that's kind of one very common feature of these communal land rights. And so here we're focusing again on the structure of land rights. So why do some places have communal versus private rights? I think a point that's also important to make sometimes is that this focus is a bit separate from the security of land rights. There's a ton of papers in this conference that focus on security. Security implies that rights are well-defined and guaranteed. And we have a lot of evidence and building evidence on how security of land rights is very important for development. So when people feel secure about their land, they make better choices and it can help spur development. But the point that a lot of authors, including people in this room, have made is that actually private and communal rights can vary in how secure they are depending on the context. So it's not necessarily the case that one is more secure than the other. It ultimately depends a little bit on the context. So for example, if there's a strong state to enforce private land rights, then private land rights might be more secure. But if there's the absence of a state, we might see kind of different types of security. And so we have a lot of evidence for how security matters, maybe less evidence on how the structure of land rights matters. And so the empirical challenge here, of course, is that property rights evolve endogenously. And so what we do to kind of try to overcome this empirical challenge, thinking about what determines the structure of land rights, is that we build on insights from Esther Bosserup and Harold Demset. So they've written a ton of interesting things on agriculture and land rights. But they both observed around the same time that societies that had longer fallow requirements, so had to leave their land fallow for longer, were much more likely to have communal land rights. And so let me take a step back. So what do I mean by what is fallowing? So fallowing is an agricultural practice where previously cultivated land is allowed to lay idle in order to let it restore its fertility. It's been called kind of the oldest and most widespread agroforestry practice to restore fertility. And fallow periods that are too short can lead to too much soil degradation, too much erosion, and ultimately lower productivity. So it's important to kind of fallow land to let it restore its fertility. And so why might longer fallowing requirements impact the type of property rights societies develop? In the paper, we go into kind of more, we have a model and everything, but the rough intuition is that land with longer fallow requirements, where you have to have land lay fallow for longer, is much costlier to protect individually and actually benefits from more communal management and protection in the absence of a strong state. So I think that's the important thing to think about in settings where there isn't a strong state. It might be better to protect and manage communal land as a community rather than individually, because individually it'll be very, very costly. So what is fallow land? Well, here's a picture. I think always people want to see pictures of the things you're talking about, but here's a very boring picture. It's what fallow land looks like. It's just a plot of land that used to be cultivated, but no one's cultivating on it right now to let it restore its soil fertility. And this argument of how longer fallow requirements increase protection costs and lead to different property rights was summarized kind of by Demset, who noticed that in places where you have to abandon land for several years to let it restore its fertility, in other words, fallow the land, property rights in land among such people require so much policing costs for too many years, during which no output is obtained, and that would just be too costly for you to do individually, so you tend to see more communal land. In contrast, in places where you don't have to fallow land as much, you tend to see more private property rights over the land. So that's kind of the main argument we're going to try to test a little bit. And so to test it, what we do is we construct an ecological measure across the world for the fallow requirement for the most suitable staple crop across grid cells using FAO models that are based on the soil type. The soil type is the main thing that ultimately matters. There's many different soil types, and the fallowing requirement varies a lot depending on the soil type. But also temperature and climate factor into these models. So we construct the fallow requirement across the world. The fallow requirement tells us the percent of time during the fallow cropping cycle that land should remain fallow. So imagine you crop land for 3 years. The fallow requirement is 50%. It implies that you should then let land lay fallow for another 3 years optimally. So these are kind of like trying to construct the optimal fallow requirement across crops across the world to give us kind of an ecological measure of fallowing across the world. And with this, what we do is we take this data and go back to our original question, which is why did some societies have these communal property rights? So we combine ethnographic data, what I talked about a little bit earlier, and this ecological data on fallow requirements to show that communal rights tend to be more common in places that had these longer fallow requirements, suggesting that these rights kind of evolve in a way to solve some of these issues related to fallowing land for long periods of time. We then ask, what are the consequences for development policies? Something people have written about is that land titling projects are sometimes less successful in places with communal land rights. So we went to test that in the data, and we find that that is the case. Places where fallow requirements are longer historically tend to have less successful land titling projects. There's more resistance to these privatization efforts. And we ask, what are the mechanisms? What might explain the resistance to some of these titling reforms? Well, we highlight that actually in weak states, we find that there's less land-related conflict and lower inequality in places with these communal land rights, suggesting that they have some benefits. So there might be this equity efficiency trade-off going on, and societies kind of prefer the way they're solving some of the land-related conflicts or inequality problems that they're faced with in these settings. But now that's just a preview. Let me talk about the details a little bit more about what we do, breaking it up first into thinking about kind of an origin of land rights before thinking about the consequences in terms of policy. And so to measure historical property right structures, we mostly rely on the standard cross-cultural sample. So this is a very detailed data set, but it has specifically questions on land rights that are really interesting. It's a sample of 186 societies chosen from the Ethnographic Atlas, which is this ethnographic data put together by anthropologists. It's chosen to be representative of this full EA sample, but each observation is culturally and historically independent from each other. We then use the ethnologue, so this tells us what languages are spoken where today across the world, to link modern groups based on their language to ancestral characteristics when we're thinking about looking at modern outcomes. How do we measure land rights? Again, measuring land rights is very complex. We just rely on what the data has here, which is this question on the communality of land. So it measures the extent to which land is organized via communal land rights, and it goes from a scale of 1 to 3. So 1 equals predominantly private, 2 equals partially communally used, and then 3 equals communal land use rights only. We also use this other variable called the cropping index, mostly to validate our fallow requirement measure. It's a rough indicator for how much fallowing societies did in agriculture. It's just a way to validate our fallowing requirement measure. It actually predicts fallowing seen in the data. And so we're going to examine the relationship between fallow requirements and land rights, estimating the following equation, try to control for a number of geographic covariates and other things we care about. And so thinking about identification, One thing you might be concerned about generally if you're going to study the relationship between fallowing and land rights is that there's a big potential for reverse causality, right? If you feel more secure in your land rights, you might fallow your land more. And so there's this reverse causality that can happen when you're just running this relationship. But here we're using an ecological measure of fallowing. We're not using how much fallowing a society actually does, but more like ecological determinants of how much to fallow your land, controlling for a number of other geographic characteristics. So you also might be concerned about omitted variable bias. So these are variables that affect both fallow lengths and land rights, independent of kind of the fallow requirements. So for this reason, we include a number of controls sequentially just to make sure they're not driving the relationship we're estimating. And then finally, there's this potential concern of measurement error. You know, we're constructing this fallow requirement, but it might not be it might be a bit noisy or might not reflect conditions on the ground. And so what we do is we validate this fallow requirement measure, so using the FAO data that they've put together, and then use measures of fallowing intensity historically and today, and show that it does seem to predict fallowing historically and today. So we're not so worried about measurement error for our measure of fallow requirements, okay? And so these are kind of some of the things we do, but the first set of results we find is that when the fallow requirement is higher, societies tended to use communal land rights to manage their land. And so fallow requirements are associated with more communal land rights. Here's the same thing in table form as we sequentially kind of include a number of different controls, show different standard errors. Overall, we see a pretty strong association of increasing the fallow requirements and communal land rights, suggesting that, you know, fallowing was an important driver of what types of land rights societies developed. It's hard to find data on kind of land rights within countries today at a very good level. Afrobarometer does have a good question to try to assess this, though Matthew's going to talk about some of this stuff even more, so hopefully we can learn even more. But we were interested, okay, we showed that there's a relationship between fallow requirements and land rights. Historically, what about today? We use the Afrobarometer data that has this question of what's the influence of traditional leaders in allocating land, and we see that longer fallow requirements are associated with more communal land allocation today in Africa. So it seems to still matter for land rights. So we turn now to what are the consequences in terms of policy and this potential for policy mismatch. This article came out a couple months ago, well, October, in The Economist, and I think everyone in this room would find it interesting, but it's making a point about how sometimes reforms kind of challenge the power of chiefs, and there's a bit of resistance to these titling reforms. And so we ask, what is the impact of communal land rights on the success of titling reforms using World Bank project data put together by aid data. So it covers World Bank funded projects between 1995 and 2014. A subset of these projects are given an outcome rating. And so we use this information to study the impacts.
You have 3 minutes, but all of
Oh, yeah.
you have none.
I have none. Yeah, I know. I was like, maybe it's like the Oscars where they shut you off. You know, they shut off your mic. I'll be done in 3 minutes. I actually don't have that much more. But yeah, perfect. So,
No, it doesn't work.
oh, I can talk it through. Yeah, I'll just talk it through. So when we look at the success of land titling projects, we see that they're less successful in these places that tended to have communal land rights, suggesting a little bit of a policy mismatch. We don't see a relationship between World Bank project success and fallow requirements for non-agricultural projects. So it suggests it's really concentrated in these land projects. Oh.
I'm sorry, but you can come to the table.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, so you can just see it here visually. We find that actually this is very much driven by early projects, so pre-2005. The World Bank kind of slowly changed its land policy. Some people in this room have written about, and there we don't find an effect for later projects. It's really about like early 1990s projects where we seem to find this impact. There's good learning happening. So what are the mechanisms? Why might there be low demand for privatization in places with longer fallowing and communal land rights? We explored two mechanisms that have been highlighted in the literature. They might be really useful in kind of providing a sense of social security and resolving conflicts. And so we use data on inequality and conflict to show that longer fallow requirements are associated with lower inequality and lower land-related conflicts, but it's particularly concentrated in places where the state is weak, so suggesting that they're kind of resolving some of these conflicts. Interestingly, too, we find that fallow requirements aren't associated with less security or lower development. So again, security and the structure of property rights are two concepts that are often bundled together, but they're not always kind of go in the same direction. And so just to conclude, we test this hypothesis about how fallow lengths affect the structure of property rights. We find that longer fallow requirements associated with less effective land titling interventions, less inequality and less conflict when the state is weak. And so trying to provide some insights into the economics of property rights and how policies can kind of better be matching their local environment. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Eduardo, and also for being such a good sport. Do we have any questions? And there.
I guess I'll kick us off. This is really interesting, and as you noticed, has a lot of overlap with what I'll present next. In fact, I'm just taking notes of some of the data sources you used. But I wanted to ask a little bit more about this mechanism that these secure fallow lengths, or I'm sorry, these longer fallow lengths then require more intense policing from these kind of customary institutions. And I'm curious if that's necessarily the case in areas of extremely low population density.
Yeah.
So we do make kind of a distinction really between kind of agriculture that relies on fallowing and more slash and burn types of agriculture. So if the frontier isn't closed and you can just move into a new area, do you still require this policing, and do you still see an effect if you kind of make that distinction?
Totally. No, so that's a really important question, and we control for population in this because that's Esther Bostorp was super interested in that, and it's like exactly her theory. So you're spot on and what Esther Bostorp would write. So we try to account for that. I still think, though, there's this potential for, we don't have great data on that, but even if kind of population is thin, there could be this potential of like other people moving in and taking land, and that's still a concern. You might have that as a potential kind of concern. But you're right, though, that the effects would probably be more concentrated in places where there is this tension, population clashes. So I think that's spot on. Yeah.
Sorry, just two-finger follow-up.
Yeah.
So I think I'd be really interested to see the interaction rather than just the control.
We haven't actually tested that, so that's a really good suggestion.
So let's take 3 questions.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
And so we had someone there.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting presentation. So I have a question one. Did you control for the soil fertility in your estimation?
Yeah.
Okay. Then that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, because if it's not controlled, then maybe the expected income from the privatization could be low. So that's why I just
totally.
asked.
No. So it's super important. We include like a couple different types of controls. So yeah.
If you can say your name before you ask your question, that'd be great. Here and there. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jake Ricker-Gilbert from Purdue. Thanks for the nice presentation. I was also going to ask about population density. I mean, I would recommend just mentioning it in the main presentation because it is Esther Bostorp's other thing. Yeah. The other thing is, and also I was curious, how do you measure population density, especially in the past?
Yeah.
And then my other question is on, how you're measuring soil fertility. Is it current soil fertility? Because, I mean, we know that the climate's changing. These agroecological conditions are changing.
Yeah.
It would be better if you had soil fertility, 500 years ago or something. But because, the cultivation practices and tenure practices affect soil fertility, as you're saying. So, there's still this reverse causality problem that I don't see how you've solved.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pablo, Balan, Tel Aviv University. So, thank you for a great presentation. The question is, are you assuming that the communal rights are so good that formal rights are not needed? And is this assumption of optimality, is there institutional variation that makes this more of a continuum? I hate the word unpack, but can you unpack what you mean by communal rights? Communities don't make decisions, so there's surely a decision-making structure within them, and this may generate variation that in turn may map into your outcome, though, when private rights are preferred or not.
Totally. So I can answer this quickly, but these are fantastic comments. Yeah, totally. So I totally agree on population density. In fact, we should emphasize it even more in the presentation. We're controlling for modern day proxies for soil because there isn't historical ones. We were concerned with that with our fallow measure because that's also based on these FAO models, but we do validate it using kind of historical proxies for fallowing. So it seems like even modern day fallowing measures predict historical fallowing, so maybe the change there isn't as strong, perhaps. And for population, how we control for that is the ethnographic data includes measures of population density that anthropologists put together. So that's what we use. So it's, yeah, that's historical population. It's not perfect, of course. Historical data often is not perfect, but yeah. So on those 2 points, totally take your points. On how communities make decisions and what's going on here, I think we're not making a stand on like which one is optimal or not. We're just kind of speaking to more this first stage of like, do people want to take them up or not? And I think generally we see like relatively low take up of some of these policies. Not in an urban setting like you're going to talk about. I think that's very different. And so we're just thinking more about this idea of like take up rather than like what are the impacts or the optimal impacts or anything like that. That we would need a model to like really structure our thoughts and would probably rely on too many assumptions. We're thinking more like what seems to be a friction here in these land titling efforts, and sometimes it's community resistance. And yeah, so I think that's how we're thinking about it, but we're not making a statement about like, is this optimal or not from a welfare perspective? In fact, there's so many distributional consequences that come from titling. Like, I think that's ultimately what goes on is like some people will win, some people will lose, and then the community sometimes can't, compensate the losers enough so that everyone benefits. That's probably what's going on, and that's why we're interested in this inequality idea. Like, Goldstein and Nutter are very much about like why do these tenure systems like persist for so long? And it's like actually they provide social insurance, they help some people in the society. So again, it's this redistribution impact of these tenure systems that we think is super interesting and understudied. So yeah, perfect. I'll leave it there. And
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo. That was great.
Thank you.
We are moving on to Matthew. A good follow-up.
So a careful observer will notice some pretty significant overlap between what you just saw and what you're about to see. So today I'm going to be presenting results from one chapter of my book-style dissertation project. In political science, we still sometimes write books, which broadly looks at variation in the uptake of formal property rights across sub-Saharan Africa and specifically West Africa. So you will notice an exciting change from the program. It's now 22 African countries instead of 21. Thanks to the LSMS releasing some new data. Okay, so I think motivation is extremely easy at this conference because I don't have to convince you that land is important. But in fact, there is kind of this broad perception, again, perhaps less so at this conference, but kind of within the broader academic discourse, that formal property rights remain incredibly rare across sub-Saharan Africa, right? You often go to African cities and you see kind of graffitis like this. And this kind of feeds into the perception that formal property rights remain incredibly rare, that uptake has been low, so on and so forth. But in reality, kind of in a lot of situations in Africa, formal land titles are actually available kind of broadly in a sporadic, piecemeal, or on-demand fashion. But kind of what we need to do here is, we know that there's all sorts of economic evidence that suggests that a lot of households. Oh, thanks. That'll match my pacing much better. There's all sorts of economic evidence that suggests that many households benefit from formal property rights. But so nevertheless, we see kind of this variation in the uptake. So this broader project is explaining variation in the uptake. Some of you saw me present a different chapter of this book dissertation, but just to give you some kind of preliminary findings. So what I'm going to show you today is that contrary to prevailing expectations that might be suggested by some kind of traditional theories of how institutions develop endogenously, we actually don't see any relationship between kind of value of land across rural Africa and rates of land titling, okay? But what we do see, in fact, is that there's a strong relationship between the potential returns to investing in land, so how much more money you could make if you make one or two investments, and kind of the rate of land titling, okay? But importantly, this relationship is moderated by the presence of strong customary institutions, right? So in areas with strong customary institutions, which I'm going to measure using more or less the same data that Eduardo just used, households title less. So in areas with strong customary institutions, there's no relationship between these returns to investment and the uptake of formal property rights, right? So why does this matter? I think there's been a broad trend in the literature, both from kind of the economics world and the political science world, that really focuses on when states and other elites, often customary elites in the African context, supply formal property rights, when they make formal property rights available to household. And there's been a little bit less literature that kind of explores the demand for formal property rights or when households actually avail themselves of these rights, okay? So this is kind of part of a broader literature that is kind of emerging that treats informality as kind of more than just the absence of formality, but as a resource in and of itself that households can kind of manipulate and leverage to their advantage. And in so doing, I am bringing the politics back into the political economy of property rights. It started as a political science job talk, so you have to imagine that line kills. Okay, so just to kind of give you an overview, again, the question we're trying to answer here is what explains variation in the prevalence of formal land titles? And kind of within kind of this broader literature on when property rights emerge, a lot of this has been focused on these endogenous theories of institutions, which suggest kind of very simply that formal property rights will emerge or individuals will acquire formal property rights when the cost of so doing when the benefit of so doing becomes equal to the cost. So it's easy to see how shifts to the value of property could shock these prevailing equilibria. So in this case, we're talking about kind of shifts in land values, then creating higher returns. Well, presumably if land values are increasing, creating higher returns to titling. Okay, so this is, again, a very simple framework. If we're thinking about costs and benefits, let's actually talk about some of these costs and benefits. I think there are broadly two sets of costs to land titling. And I'm not going to get into this all that much, but I'm kind of just making the point that titling is actually costly. So one way in which it's costly is that there's often an administrative fee. In Senegal, for instance, this is about 5,000 francs per hectare, about $8. Elsewhere, it's substantially more expensive, but nevertheless, it's often subsidized by people like the generous donors in this room. I'm just realizing that there's a BibTech issue here. That's fun. Pardon me. But kind of beyond these administrative costs, we also can think that land titling might be an inherently risky activity. Right, so in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, we see kind of land regimes that in fact have overlapping claims over similar parcels of land. Right, so if we imagine, if we take, for instance, the context that Eduardo was just discussing, you can imagine in an area with communal land tenure, the community has some claim over this piece of land, but as an individual, maybe my family has farmed this piece of land for 20 years, and so if the land registrar comes to town, it's not immediately clear who's going to end up with the title to that piece of land. So enforcing the issue, you're actually kind of accepting a bit of risk that you might not end up with as much land as you started with. And there's kind of anecdotal and qualitative evidence to suggest this. Right, but on the other hand, of course, we know that households benefit after receiving a land title because they're able to make kind of bigger investments in their land, okay? You can't really plant a tree if you can't plant a tree crop that might take 4 to 5 years for production to be realized if you're unsure if you're still going to have access to the parcel in 4 to 5 years. Again, I don't think I have to sell this particular audience on that claim. Right, so kind of broadly, if you feel more confident that you'll receive the returns to investment, you'll make the investment more, and this is kind of the key benefit of land titles that I'm going to discuss today. Although I'm going to make the caveat here that kind of the way that these theories are generally kind of organized, they're just talking about the value of land and using the value of land as almost a proxy for the returns to formalization. And so I'm going to make the qualification here that this specific quantity of interest is actually the returns to potential investment rather than the land value themselves. Okay? And I'm also going to argue, again, as Eduardo just did, that strong customary institutions can decrease the marginal increase in security provided by titles, right? So we know that often customary institutions do a pretty tolerable job of protecting property rights, especially if you have, say, a competent chief and often a less competent kind of local state institutions. And we can think that chiefs might have kind of incentives to retain this power. It allows them to control over land, allows them to sanction other areas. And of course, households themselves might kind of prefer these customary institutions, either because they're correct in thinking the customary institutions work better, or because it's what they're familiar with. Okay, so if we kind of distill all this down into a couple of different hypotheses, I'm going to hypothesize that households in areas with higher land values and households in areas with higher returns to investments are going to be more likely to possess a formal land title, but that this is going to be moderated by the presence of strong customary institutions. Okay, so these are kind of big picture questions. How am I going to do this? And in doing this, what I'm trying to do is kind of provide some just real cross-national descriptive evidence, not causal evidence, but just to see whether kind of the trends we see in land titling are actually consistent with kind of these theories that we tend to take as accepted. Okay? So I'm going to use kind of two data sources to do this. So one of these is going to be combining data from the DHS surveys and the World Bank's equivalent, which is the Living Standards Measurement Surveys. So by aggregating all of these for the land-specific variables, we end up with about 60 different survey waves in 22 African countries. And I'm going to be looking specifically at whether a household has at least one land title. And I should specify here that I'm looking specifically at agricultural land, though in the paper itself, I use whether or not a household has a title for their dwelling place as a placebo outcome. Okay? And I'm going to try and explain this variation using a new approach to measuring land values, which I'm going to share a little bit later. And I'll be using Murdoch data to proxy for the strength of customary institutions. So again, I probably don't have to introduce this data to a lot of the people here, but if we combine these 22 countries and 60 survey waves, we end up with about 170,000 observations with non-missing kind of values for land titling. And I should say most of those 200,000 drop out because they're either urban households or because they don't own land. Okay, so we're looking at it only really makes sense to look at whether or not you have a title if you actually own land. So we're just going to drop out those observations. I can talk about those later. Okay, and so just to give you like a first really broad overlook, we can see that this is actually what the data look like if we examine the most recent versions of either DHS or LSMS, depending on what's most recent. And we can already see that there's really substantial subnational heterogeneity, right? So if you can imagine a story in which we're trying to explain, you know, kind of land titling just by these national regimes of property rights, we can see that in fact the national regimes themselves don't have a lot of explanatory power here. There's a lot of subnational variation, even though it's absolutely true that, of course, countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda have much, much, much higher rates of land titling than, say, Burundi or Malawi. Okay? The next big question is if we want to have a consistent measure of crop value across sub-Saharan Africa, this is kind of like no mean feat in areas where markets are often both kind of illegible and poorly defined. So I'm going to do this by interacting two sources of data. Right? So one is again, the same FAO data that you just saw Eduardo use, although a slightly different flavor of it. So I'm going to look at the total attainable yield for 22 different crops. Okay, and this is available at about a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer resolution. And I'm going to interact that with historic commodity price data. So the first source of data gives me the kilograms per hectare of a specific crop that you should feasibly be able to produce. And the second gives me how much that crop would sell per kilogram on the international market. I'm just going to take the maximum of those two. So this isn't actually, this superficially resembles a shift share style instrument. It's not. I can talk about that a little more. Okay, so this is kind of the overall value or the overall measure of land value, but I can actually tweak this in two ways to try and back out the returns to making investments into parcels. Okay, so I can do this in two ways. The first is by kind of running the model with two separate specifications, so I can back out both the maximum attainable value with fertilizer and the maximum attainable value without fertilizer. I can use that as a measure of the returns to fertilization. You can also break down the crop data by tree crops. So I could see the returns to planting, say, cocoa over something like maize, okay? And so we can think of these as a short-term investment, the fertilization, or more of a long-term investment. So a lot of these tree crops require, again, maybe 4 to 5 years for the tree to become commercially viable, okay? So these are longer-term investments. And again, I'm going to interact these with kind of data which measure hierarchy in pre-colonial institutions for Murdoch's ethnographic atlas. Okay, so just to summarize, I've got an outcome variable here, which is the binary indicator for if a household has a title, an explanatory variable, which is these measures of land values, and then this moderating variable, which is the strength of customary institutions. And again, the goal here is really just to see at the broadest possible level, what trends seem to fit with the existing data. And of course, in the rest of the book project, I'll kind of drill down into some of the mechanisms. Okay, so finally, you've sat long enough. What are the results? Well, the first thing I'm going to show you is a simple decomposition of variance that shows you that kind of if we take some of these more supply side explanations of kind of land titling, we can think of a lot of these things as varying at various kind of state levels, right? There might be a national policy for land formalization, say explaining the difference between like land titling rates in Ethiopia and land titling rates in Malawi. But there are also, you can think of kind of geographic effects all the way down to the kind of region level or enumeration area level. And we can see that there's kind of quite a bit of variation being explained by all these levels. So it's not just kind of, it's not just that some states make land titles available, right? There's quite a bit more variation to be explained. Okay, so these are the first sets of results that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to jump the gun a little bit and show you that I should also specify these are results from just an OLS specification of the variables that I mentioned, broken out by the different fractions of a second level administrative division that are covered by one of these hierarchical pre-colonial institutions. And we can see that at all levels of kind of the strength of pre-colonial hierarchy, there's no relationship between the value of land and the fraction of households that have some kind of formal land title. Okay? But if we move on to some of these short-term investments, we can actually see that there's pretty strong variation according to whether or not the area was occupied by hierarchical pre-colonial institution. Okay? So in areas where there was no hierarchical pre-colonial institution, we see that households are responding to the returns to fertilization by seeking land titles. And again, this makes sense following, if households think that they need a title to receive the returns to their investment, and then know that the investments would be really beneficial, they might be more likely to seek title. Although, again, this is descriptive, not causal. But then if we look at the long-term results, we can see that, in fact, at all levels of kind of the return, or at all levels of hierarchical institutions, households who could benefit more from planting tree crops are more likely to possess a land title. So kind of, it looks like customary institutions matter here, but it's not 100% clear that they matter in all situations. Okay, so this was using kind of the land value measures aggregated to the second level administrative division. That might be suboptimal because these things are pretty large, but the benefit of using the second level administrative division is that I can show you results from kind of every observation that I have, all 170,000 observations. For a subset of observations, if I'm remembering correctly, about 80,000, these data also include center points for the enumeration area, which allows me to kind of drill down much further and really look at kind of the local conditions around a village. So I've kind of already spoiled the surprise here, but we can see that the results change a little bit, but kind of broadly seem to be consistent, where the value of land is having more or less null effects. The returns to fertilization aren't having much of an effect. Remember, they had a smaller effect previously. But again, kind of the returns to planting tree crops seems to be associated with higher levels of land title. Okay, so just to give you an idea, this is kind of the opening step of a project. It's showing that there's a lot of subnational variation in the uptake of formal land titles. But that's kind of a question, not an answer. So I'm going to try and talk over some of the next steps. So just to summarize where we've come from, it seems like households don't always pursue formal land titles, even when formal land titles are available, right? And so it also seems that these kind of conventional explanations that really center the value of the underlying asset, right, these endogenous institution style examples, don't seem to be explaining as much variation as you might otherwise expect, okay? But we do see some relationship between the returns to investments, the household demand for land titles, but this is kind of being moderated by the presence of strong customary institutions, as is entirely consistent with what Eduardo presented to you. Okay, so this kind of still leaves us with the questions that's driving the rest of the dissertation project, which is who wants property rights? So just to give you an overview of how I'm going to be answering this question, the first way is through a field conjoined experiment in Senegal, which I presented here yesterday, and which I imagine several people in the room saw as well, which suggests that households who distrust local governments place less weight on formal land titles in a series of hypothetical disputes, as well as a natural experiment in Côte d'Ivoire, which really unpacks the role of customary elites in kind of either facilitating or impeding land titling, right? So all of this is getting at a variation in the marginal returns to formal land titling at the household level. Okay, so just to wrap up, we know that the majority of household, well, I suppose Klaus has the most up-to-date numbers, but a substantial number of African households continue to work in the agricultural sector, which means that land tenure is potentially a transformative form of property rights, right? But kind of beyond their role in economic development, we might care about property rights for a variety of kind of more political sciencey reasons, right? It drives legibility, it's kind of a form of state building that uniquely you get to opt into, and it might condition a variety of other kind of political behaviors. And so this research is hopefully kind of continuing a broader literature on the political economy of land development and formality. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Matthew. We're going to open up for discussion. I'm going to start with a question. So you make quite a sweeping statement about the inability of economic factors in determining land titling, and I'm just not buying it. So I don't buy your identification for concluding, making such big statements about that. We have an observational study, and you're telling me on average there is no, you don't find a correlation. But I would have taken maybe alternative path to understanding whether a change and kind of use more of an organized, event study or a combination of event study to see when the value of land changes, maybe because irrigation is put in or something which is exogenous to that land happens, then whether or not there is a change in the demand for land titling. And then I would be differently convinced by your analysis. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about how could you go about this in a slightly different way? Because we jump into the politics very quickly, but I'm really not convinced that the economic factors don't matter.
Okay.
Daniel.
Yeah. Thank you. I think just from one of your graphs, or see Ethiopia and Rwanda are the exceptions, right? Mm-hmm. And in these two countries, customary institutions are either weak or completely do not exist in terms of managing land rights. Mm-hmm. So have you checked by, let's say, dropping these two countries from the analysis if it really affects the results?
Which two countries?
Ethiopia and Rwanda.
Hi, Ben Linka from Millennium Challenge Corporation. As you were talking, my first kind of thought was, well, you're talking about decisions by households to take up land titles, but in practice we know that land titling interventions are often systematic rather than sporadic, right? And you presented the results showing that geography, geography doesn't explain everything, which is helpful. But I guess I'm wondering, to what extent is this decision that you're talking about maybe one that governments are making to title this kind of land rather than individual households? And similarly, have you looked at, or have you thought about maybe looking at, running the analysis only on areas where you have kind of a mix of titled and untitled land rather than including areas where you maybe have, almost everyone has titles or almost no one does?
I'll just respond to those few questions, and maybe I can take more questions after that. So the first question is that you're not buying the identification strategy, to which I would simply respond, I wouldn't buy this identification strategy either. So kind of the way that I'm thinking about this paper, and again, this is why it's part of a book and rather than a chapter by itself, is just as a way to look at what these broad patterns are. Like, where are there titles and where aren't there a lot of titles, kind of at a subnational level. And then we can start thinking about kind of, once we've seen what the overall patterns are, we can start using some interesting identification strategies to really unpack what might be driving this variation. So yes, you are not wrong. I will say I think the kind of event study design is an interesting idea. I mean, these are just repeated cross sections. I mean, everybody in this room, I assume, knows the DHS and the LSMS intimately. So you know kind of what can and can't be done with the data, and so that's why there's some additional work being done here. To the second question, yes, the results are robust to dropping Ethiopia and Rwanda. Well, actually, technically, I should say I know that results are robust to dropping Ethiopia or Rwanda. You're right, I'll rerun that, dropping them both, because I think those are very much the exceptions. And to Ben's comment that these, I'm kind of talking about household decisions here, but you're absolutely right that land is, these land use interventions are often systematic rather than sporadic. And I think two responses. One is kind of absolutely that's the case. And so you do see, you know, I'm not making a case that economic explanations are totally wrong or that kind of that like no part of this variation is being explained by these kind of geographic variables. You're absolutely right that they are. What I'm saying instead is that this is an important outcome and there's a lot of leftover variation. Well, I would kind of push back a little bit in that even in kind of these more systematic registration projects, we often see resistance, and we often see resistance in some areas rather than others. So I don't think any of these projects are truly kind of systematic, and so this might be part of the explanation for kind of why we see resistance in some areas and not other areas. And again, I think the kind of the rest of the project speaks more to that.
We have a few minutes. Yes.
I have a two-finger on Ben's point. And I think it would be really interesting to look at state capacity, though, because we know that states, even within a country, are directing public goods of all sorts, but land titling in particular, to some regions and to some kinds of individuals. And so thinking about heterogeneity there in terms of what kinds of places states are able to direct titling efforts.
And I
Yes.
think there are people online, so are there people online?
Thank you, Laura. Okay, what if I speak now? Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. So 2 points. The first one, there's no clear answer to it, which is it's hard to know how to think about the pre-colonial jurisdictional hierarchy measure, and where is that variation coming from? What's it correlated with? How should we interpret that heterogeneity? I wouldn't know where to start. The second point is, do you account in your paper for different modes of subsistence, right? So a large share of land in Africa is used for pastoralism. And once you account for that, I wonder, does your puzzle become less of a puzzle, right? Because the returns to formal titling aren't the same for pastoralists, particularly mobile pastoralists, as they are for farmers. So it'd be an interesting thing to think about, I think.
Great. I think there was, I can take one more.
It seems sad to me that you have lost over half your observations in your data set, because you are focusing your analysis on people who have land, which is obvious. I mean, titling is kind of your main focus in this project, but it seems like also an interesting question to understand who has access to land, and what it might be difficult to construct a variable that indicates somebody who doesn't have access to land who would like to have it, but it seems like it's important to see this correlation between these institutions that you're interested in and people's ability to have access to any land at all. Because it's one thing not to have title, but it's another thing not to have any land. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go in order again. In terms of Laura's question, I think, yes, you're absolutely right. And I'm thinking about ways to kind of operationalize state capacity here. I think, Eduardo's presentation gave me some ideas, but I think broadly that's kind of the next step for this paper. So I would just say, yes, you're absolutely right. In terms of the next question about, I'm sorry, I caught your first question, but not your second question because I was writing quickly. In terms of wanting to know more about hierarchy, this is a similar variable from the kind of ethnographic atlas you saw earlier, kind of measuring the levels or the number of kind of hierarchical levels in a pre-colonial kingdom. So I think that part of it is relatively simple. I think the accuracy of it is a much bigger problem with this kind of measure. So I think this kind of ethnographic atlas is the least bad measure of hierarchical institutions that we have. But I'm actively thinking about kind of better ways to capture this. In terms of focusing on people my focus on people who have land rather than people who kind of are landless, I would just say that that's a good point, and I'm not entirely sure how to address that, but I'd love to keep thinking about it.
All right, thank you very much. We are passing it on to Pablo.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be presenting my work here at the bank. I'll be talking about property rights and social institutions in urban Africa, which is joint work with my colleague John Weigel and co-authors. This paper has been now in the works for several years. So it's a pleasure also to be presenting the paper in a room with people who deeply inspired the paper, people like Mike Albertus, Eduardo Montero, Marco, and also Klaus. I will take issue with some of your work. So I don't have to emphasize the well-known benefits of property rights in this room. All wealthy democratic countries have secure property rights. Citizens who enjoy secure property rights can reap the fruit of their investments without fearing expropriation. Property rights are correlated with a host of development outcomes. The bank wants most of the world population to have secure title to their land. However, in most parts of the world, citizens still do not enjoy secure property rights. In fact, in many developing countries, informality has proved quite persistent. We can think of two types of explanation for this phenomenon. On the supply side, the monetary and also the transaction costs of formalization tend to be quite high, which may deter citizens from formalizing their land. However, some have advanced a demand-side explanation, namely that informal institutions and local actors may provide tenure security and act as a substitute for formal land property rights. So in this view, citizens do not demand formal property rights because they don't really need them. In this paper, we study this problem in the specific domain of land property rights in sub-Saharan Africa, a region where formal property rights to land are still rare, despite many decades and a lot of money spent in formalization initiatives, many of them by the bank. The region also ranks last in a World Bank, in an old World Bank index measuring the quality of land administration. I should update this with the new measures that we learned about a couple of days ago. An index comprising coverage, dispute resolution mechanisms, transparency of information, infrastructure, and so on. And registration costs are also the highest in the world. So in this paper, we ask whether reducing barriers to formalization can increase the demand for formal land titles. To answer this, the paper draws on a randomized land titling program in the city of Kananga, which is the fourth largest in the DR Congo, a program that reduced most barriers that citizens face to formalize their land. The intervention was done in collaboration with the provincial government of Kasai Central. The goal of the intervention was to make land titling easier and cheaper. We agreed to implement a land titling program that randomly offers citizens the opportunity to gain access to land titles at a fixed subsidized price. Randomization was done at the individual level, and the whole intervention took almost 3 years. Just to telegraph the main results, I will show you that yes, the program worked. It increased demand for and the acquisition of land titles, but not for everyone. In fact, there is significant variation in who demands a land title, which is partly explained by informal institutions. Specifically, I will show you that citizens who are more engaged with local informal institutions are more likely to demand a land title. I will then look at the effects of the program and show you that it crowded out citizens' participation in these very same local informal institutions. So when citizens are actually offered formal property rights, they are more likely to exit local informal institutions. So what's the argument? Currently, popular view is that informal institutions and communal land rights may provide sufficient tenure security, which in turn may explain the low adoption of land titles and the failure of many land formalization programs. In fact, most of the hypotheses we had pre-registered in our pre-analysis plan were explicitly or implicitly based on this logic. However, social institutions do not just provide informal insurance. They also come at a cost. They involve monetary payments, but also reciprocity. Think about norms of sharing and the like. This is what economists call informal taxation, and some political scientists call social extraction. Now, we argue that when deciding whether to formalize their land, citizens will weigh the benefits of informal insurance against the cost of social extraction. We further argue that this trade-off will be resolved differently in different settings. Specifically, the calculation is likely to be different in urban areas where land values have been rising, the cost of extraction is higher, and the benefit of membership in these institutions is likely lower. So, to be more precise and fix ideas, we can lay out possible theoretical relationships between social institutions and titling. The substitution view yields a clear prediction. Higher participation in social institutions should lead to lower take-up of formal titles. That is not what we find. Now, titling and social institutions may also be complements. Some people just demand more insurance of all kinds. So in that case, higher participation in social institutions could lead to higher take-up, but there would be no crowding out after people get titles. Titles and institutions would reinforce each other. That's not what we find. Instead, what we find is more consistent with what we call imperfect substitution. Higher participation in social institutions predicts take-up of titles, but we also find a crowding out effect. All right. This suggests that land titles dominate informal institutions. Once citizens are offered formal titles, they readily switch and exit the informal equilibrium. Let me now say a few words about the context. This paper draws on a field experiment in the city of Kananga, again, the fourth largest in the DR Congo. Population is about 1.6 million. The median income is about $1.5 per person per day. And as in the rest of the country, state capacity is fairly low. A few words on the land titling system. Very few citizens have a formal title in the status quo. Citizens experience tenure insecurity on a fairly regular basis. Conflicts with neighbors are frequent. Conflicts about inheritance are also frequent. And property values are also rising. Now, a couple of words on land titles in the DRC. Contrary to what you may think, land titles, and even in this context, are not simply scraps of paper. They do confer higher tenure security. From focus groups, we know that citizens have high valuation of titles, and comparative evidence points in the same direction. Titles can be used as collateral, but unfortunately, most people remain outside the banking system. Now, obtaining a land title in Kananga in the status quo is difficult and costly. The procedure involves several steps. There's a lot of red tape involved. But again, from focus groups, we know that citizens report paying up to $1,000 for a title. Some even report hiring a lawyer. Now, this paper is about the interaction between land titling and social institutions. So let me give you some background about the social institutions in our setting. By social institutions, I just mean rules that govern interactions within a community. In fact, we also include what some people would call social organizations, but I don't want to get too definitional here. So a useful way to classify social institutions is as vertical or horizontal, depending on whether the agency in charge of enforcement is of higher or equal social standing. Social institutions embody benefits, mainly informal insurance, but also, as I mentioned before, social extraction or informal taxation. Let me begin with fleshing out the logic of horizontal institutions in our setting. I will focus on the four main institutions in this city: rotating savings and credit associations, mutual aid societies, churches, and contributions that citizens make to events like weddings and funerals. There is some evidence that these provide some level of insurance. However, they also come at a cost. Obviously, the cost of social institutions is extremely hard to measure. One first take is to add up all the payments that citizens make to these institutions. So if we add all these payments, the total amount adds up to almost 12% of their monthly income, which is a significant amount. Obviously, this is not capturing everything. From focus group, we have some information about the logic and the burden of these contributions, which have three characteristics. Solicitation is typically made door to door. Citizens who fail to contribute face social sanctions, including gossip, isolation, and even ostracism. And finally, contributions tend to follow a progressivity norm. Now, turning to vertical institutions, we focus on chiefs. I don't have to explain much about chiefs and Africa in this room. We focus on urban chiefs. In Francophone Africa, they're a very common institution. And in the DRC, chiefs actually were formally recognized by the state in 1972. Chiefs have to be approved by the government, but their tenure is often for life. The position can also run in the family, and chiefs are considered high status. There are several types of chiefs with different geographic jurisdictions. Each neighborhood has a chief. Each street or avenue has a chief. Basically, chiefs act as intermediaries, as a link between citizens and the state. They organize different activities, intervene in conflicts among neighbors, and so on. And they also organize an informal labor tax called salongo. I'll return to this later on. Okay, so chiefs vary in different dimensions. We focus on two dimensions: the connections they have with citizens and their power. I'll return to this in a bit. Now, let me describe the land titling program. The program involved the three main land titles in the DR Congo. Here they are listed in decreasing legal weight, but they all confer higher tenure security relative to whatever documents citizens have. So again, the main goal of the program was to allow citizens to obtain a title. It offers citizens the chance to obtain a title with a simplified procedure at a lower price. And in doing this, it significantly reduced the transaction costs and the red tape that citizens face to get the title. Given the average price of a title in our program and the average value of a plot in the eligible sample, the program brought registration costs to a level comparable to that of many European countries, 2.5%. So who was eligible for this program? So first, respondents needed to show interest in the program. Then our local partner, the Land Titling Office, set eligibility criteria that were later on changed. But an important point here is that these are not squatters and that renters were not eligible either. So citizens who had an old document from, say, the colonial period could update it and get one that is now formally recognized by the state, or they could upgrade it by requesting one that confers higher tenure security. Okay, so among those who were interested and eligible, we randomized and offered the treatment group the chance to participate in the program. Now, for sampling, we partitioned the city into different polygons or neighborhoods, and within each polygon, we randomly sampled 12 households. I will skip the technical details on randomization, but this was all done at the individual level. And randomization achieved balance despite changes in eligibility criteria. Happy to talk about this later on. So how do you produce a land title in Kananga in our campaign? So compared to everything we've seen in this conference, georeferencing, blockchain, high-tech titling, we did this pretty much in an artisanal way, hiring people to measure plots with basic tools, measurement tape, tracing paper, you get the idea. So the simplified procedure involved 4 steps. The first one was a technical visit. Respondents assigned to treatment receive a visit by a team of agents from the land titling and cadastral offices. These are the 2 bureaucratic agencies involved in the program. And then the land titling agent checked the respondents' existing documents, and the cadastral agent measured the plot. These documents were transmitted to the admin headquarters in the city, and if everything was okay, then respondents could go to the bank and pay. Then the file got reviewed by the head of the land titling office. A typist produced the title using this old Belgian typewriter, which you cannot really see, but it's there. And then finally, our team delivered the titles door to door after 3 years. Okay, so that's the logistics. Now, turning to the results. So first, I'll just say a few words on the data sources we use. We surveyed respondents before and after treatment and conducted 2 online surveys, one immediately after the program and one 6 to 8 months later. There's another survey going on now, but we also use admin data to see who actually got the title. And then to measure program take-up, we measure 2 different outcomes. First, starting the titling process, which is a costly step in and of itself. It involves respondents actually scheduling a visit with the state agents. So we take this to be a measure of demand. And second, a measure of actually completing the titling process and obtaining a title. Okay, so I'll walk you through the results real quick. The first result is that the program worked. It increased demand for land titles by 44 percentage points, and also the acquisition of titles by 14 percentage points. However, there's huge variation in who gets a title. So what explains this heterogeneous take? So the usual suspects work in the right direction. Property value, which we measure using some machine learning algorithm, predicts demand. Income and education are also predictive of demand. Migrants seem a bit less likely to demand a title. So this is heterogeneous take-up by socioeconomic factors, so the usual suspects. Now, the focus of this paper is on the interaction between titling and institutions. Let me begin by horizontal institutions. Most of them seem to be predictive of demand, but not of actually getting a title. Again, this is inconsistent with the substitute's view that predicts that higher engagement or participation in these institutions would lower demand. Now, turning to vertical institutions, some measures of connections with chiefs seem to be predictive of demand. For example, knowing your chief's name, or well, if the chief is really established where you live, that also predicts demand, but not completion. Focusing now on other attributes of chiefs connected to chief's power, They don't seem to affect demand, but they do seem to be predictive of completion. Specifically, if your chief is a member of a political party, if your chief is a member of the ruling party, and if they are very active in organizing this informal tax that I told you about, well, that seems to dampen actual obtention of titles. Okay. Oops. Okay, real quick, reduced form effects. Now I'm going to show you intent to treat effects of the program on 2 index measures of participation in social institutions. Horizontal institutions at the top, participation decreased, and the program also worsened citizens' views of chiefs. This is again inconsistent with the complements view that would say that both reinforce each other. We can unpack these indexes and individual components. Some things are a bit noisier, but here is the unpacking for horizontal institutions, and here is the unpacking for the program worsening citizens' views of chiefs. Okay, so this concludes the presentation of the empirical results. So, in this presentation, I showed you that formal land property rights have the capacity to crowd out participation in social institutions, that participation in social institutions also shapes demand for land titles. So social institutions shape and are shaped by formalization interventions. In doing so, I showed you that land titles can have social effects. In fact, I believe that this is the first paper to document social effects of formal titles. We also challenged the notion that social institutions are an effective substitute for formal land rights. So from a policy perspective, this is saying that first, well-designed interventions can significantly increase demand for titles, but it also illustrates how social institutions crucially interact with these interventions. So this shed light on the interaction between the two. This concludes my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Let me kick it off by saying, as an Italian growing up in a Catholic country, this is the first time I hear the church being referred as a horizontal institution. Specifically, the whole institution was designed to maintain land into the church and avoid other people's having titling. But this is not a comment, it's just... but quite interesting, very interesting paper. I was wondering, in terms of mechanisms, whether we could interpret your results in terms of unobservable, entrepreneurial variables in the populations that demands titling. And let me explain that. You know, so if you're interested in promoting yourself and your property, you need these political connections and participating in social environments. But once you find the different ways of getting there, those are just costly and inefficient way of obtaining those economic rights. But hold on to your thoughts and let me open up the discussion. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm not fully convinced about your argument that is not a perfect substitute, just because I believe to state this, you would need to look at a much longer period. I mean, once you are utilizing social institutions to protect the title, is not that you can drop out immediately from these institutions for a variety of reasons that are relatively easy to understand. But over time, you can definitely rely less on these contributions. And I believe let's say the smoking gun for your argument would be to show some kind of contribution that is unobservable to the social institutions owners. Something like, anyway, whatever. We can discuss about the details later. There are a couple of papers that do that. And,
Thanks, Pablo. It's a great paper and a ton of work. In your theoretical section, you're talking about both the informal costs and informal benefits of these vertical and horizontal institutions. But then it seems in the empirical section that you focus almost exclusively on kind of exposure to the costs of these institutions. So I wonder if you have any information on whether or not households have specifically benefited from these. So we talk about informal institutions as social insurance quite a bit. Do you have any information on whether households have received transfers from their customary institutions, or kind of benefit in other ways? For example, you could also think if the chief is your brother, then you might be kind of more sympathetic to these institutions. And I bet you'd find some heterogeneity there as well.
And I loved your paper. It might not be the case that one might expect that informal institutions in an urban setting, I understand them to be more ad hoc, if you will, than customary tenure institutions, certainly in rural areas, in that they are not sort of at the pinnacle or are insinuated with dissent groups occupying a territory for a long time with a long, deep tradition of tenure rules and very socially cohere kind of organization. And so there might be, given sort of a reasonable opportunity to exit that quite informal arrangement, to jump into something that offers, gives some perception of greater security. Now, a key question, I always ask this question, Heinz knows this, in all of this would be, when we get to the stage when those property rights are transacted, and the extent to which the transactions are registered. And so you may have a kind of an informality even emerging in, we've got the title, but, is that going to support transactions going forward?
Okay,
Yeah.
back to you.
Thank you all for this. These are great questions and comments. So to your question, Ariana, whether people who are more entrepreneurial are more likely to seek these avenues to begin with, is it?
Well, just from my limited experience in living in Africa, there are a lot of investments in these informal structures because you have to maintain your reputation for the land and the property to be assigned to you by the chief. If you lose your reputation, these properties can be taken away from you. And so you have a stake in continuing this relationship. But once you get the title, those incentives are not there anymore, or maybe not as salient to your investments in those institutions.
Right. Yeah. So we can think, for example, that people view chiefs as development brokers. That's a common view in political science. So people may think that they could get the title even through our program, through the chief, and that might explain some of the results I showed you first. On the other hand, the positive demand elicited by connections with chiefs could also reflect the cost of these connections. So it's kind of compatible with both views, the cost of the close connections and also the fact that you could view chiefs as a vehicle to get a title. One thing I'll show you is that an alternative explanation for the horizontal institutions result is that, okay, these networks are used to share information. So perhaps it's not that membership in these networks is costly, but people learn about the program as they learn about other social programs through networks. Here I'm showing you that this is not the case because prior to the treatment, membership in these networks predicts interest in titles like before treatment. So that's predictive of interest, but it's not confounding the effect of treatment, if that makes sense. Marco, I'm not sure what you mean by unobservable, and why the smoking gun test would be something unobservable. I'm happy to chat more here. One thing I'll say is that when people talk about complements or substitutes, one thing I wanted to emphasize is that These views, the way we think about interaction between formal and informal institutions, at least in political science, political economy, they have observable implications for both take-up and effects. And given our design, we can observe both. So in a way, given that the adoption of land rights is usually endogenous, we can't observe half of the picture that we need to assess these relationships of substitution and complementarity. Have to talk more. Then, well, of course, these are short-term effects. In a way, that's a drawback, but it's also surprising that we observe any effects in the short run, and we're also now in the process of analyzing the long-term effects. Matthew, benefits of informal institutions. I don't have that backup slide here among my many backup, but there's depends on which sample you look at. There is for most outcomes, there's no correlation between membership in informal institutions and a set of outcomes. For one larger sample, there is, well, they decrease the chances that you experience hunger lately, so that's kind of a welfare effect. But in general, there's no correlation between membership and welfare. Then, Mr. Laurie, yeah, I fully agree that these are different from lineage-based institutions linked to land. One way to think about this in networks or urban institutions is what a recent PhD thesis calls defensive coalitions. So people paper up, and then people use coalitions to defend their titles informally. Now this insurance comes at a premium. So I think that's another way of looking at these urban social institutions. Thank you again for all these great, challenging questions.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm going to invite Daniel.
Thank you. Thanks so much. My talk today will be about land and credit market effects of urban light titling in Lesotho, a program supported by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I think I also would like to acknowledge their support for this research activity, and it's a joint work with, once again, with Klaus Deininger. So let me start with the motivation of, or the motivation behind this study. As you all know, despite strong prior expectation since Hernando de Seto's 2006 book, there is, lack of empirical evidence regarding the impact of land titling on credit access. I think, of course, there are some exceptions in the area of tenure security, female empowerment, and land-related investment, particularly in rural areas. So why this limited impact? We believe that it is due to three key factors: project design, data quality, and timing. I think frequently there is lack of a regulatory framework, as mentioned earlier over there, to prevent informality. I mean, first, time registration, reversing to informality is an issue. And second, household survey data is often inconsistent or noisy in measuring, rare events such as registered land transactions or mortgages, thereby obscuring true effects. And third, there is, insufficient time for the effects to materialize fully, or for program participants to adapt in leveraging the newly acquired titles. But there is still hope, and the Lesotho Land Administration Reform project help us to address these issues head on. First, enacted laws in 2010, followed by implementation of land titling in Montero City in 2021, help us to separately assess the impact of policy changes to that of titling programs. And second, availability of digitized land registry data for about four decades. We can mitigate measurement errors that are really affecting results from household surveys data. Finally, availability of this, nearly 4-century data with the implementation of the program between 2021 and 2013, that provides us with short and long-term panel data to look at the impact of titling on credit and land market participation in Montero City. So just a brief overview of the project components. With the support of MCC, the Lesotho government undertook comprehensive legal and institutional reforms, as I mentioned earlier, also implemented systematic titling in Montero City. So with regard to legal reforms, the Lesotho government built on the 2006 Legal Capacity Marriage Persons Act that allows women to own property, make really a significant stride in terms of empowering women with property rights. Specifically, the 2010 Land Act and Land Authority Act included provisions, with respect to female co-ownership as the default arrangement while titling are issued. The second one is the institutional reform. I think the first change was the establishment of an autonomous land administration authority, and following that, they conducted revisions of the workflows, including titling-related workflows, with the aim of improving the quality and efficiency of service delivery. And then they also established a digital cadastre and a registry, which is really a big step. And then they also eliminated the ministerial consent required to register land transactions as well as mortgages. I think getting this ministerial consent used to take several months, discouraging land market activities as well as that of using land or property as a collateral. And then the last one is the rollout of the systematic titling in Montero City, which allowed to title about 55,000 properties. So this figure just shows the rollout of the titling in Montero City. It was done in 3 phases. In 2011, they started pilot in a few pockets, and then slowly expanded until that of 2013. But of course, titles were continue being issued after the demarcation and adjudication was completed in 2013. So just to give you some summary statistics. This is just to show you the difference between systematically and sporadically titled parcels in Montero City. I think there are 2 takeaways from this analysis. The first one is, in general, parcels registered sporadically tend to be larger and situated closer to the CBD compared to those registered systematically under the land tenure regularization program. But then when we look at the timeline, if you compare the first and the last column, the last one is parcels titled between 2015 and 19 through the sporadic process. We clearly see that parcels newly registered after 2015 through a sporadic process exhibit characteristics similar to those included in the systematic titling. This is a descriptive statistics based on the administrative data. As I mentioned earlier, there were more than 55,000 titles issued between 1981 and that of 2019. I think if you look at this column, most of the titles, or more than 2/3 of the titles, were issued between 2011 and 14. I think key things are, the first one is, female property ownership jumped from about 40% before the reform to that of more than 85% after the reform. And then if you look at the last two rows, you clearly see transfers per year as well as mortgages per year jumped from about 100 to more than 300 per year. This is really a significant shift in terms of land market and credit market participation. So, as I mentioned earlier, the key reforms were to reduce transaction costs in terms of time to register mortgages and time to register land transactions by removing the ministerial consent. We clearly see, this figure shows for mortgages, and we clearly see a significant drop in terms of the time taken to register mortgage transactions. It was about 150 days before the reform. Now it is about 21 days to registered mortgages. We also see a significant drop here in terms of registering sales transactions. It goes from 456 to 120 days. It was not an immediate drop, but we clearly see here some gradient over time. I think this may be due to the fact that registering sales transactions requires maybe subdivision, surveying, and so on, which may take a bit more time than registering mortgage transactions. So let me now quickly move to the identification strategy, and I will also highlight some of the key results. What we did is, we divided Montero city into 250 by 250 meter blocks to be able to establish both spatial and temporal panel for our analysis. So using these blocks, we employ a block fixed effect on a matched sample, and we try to distinguish between the two interventions. That is the policy change that affects everyone. This is pretty much a before-after analysis, and then the systematic titling in Montero city that affects only eligible blocks. So we consider three types of outcome variables. One is registered parcels. This is mostly to check the efficacy of the program. And then we looked at registered land as well as mortgage transactions, of course, in all cases disaggregated by gender. So in terms of the key results, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we used the short and long panels to look at the impact. In the short panel, utilizing eligibility for systematic titling with a matched sample, our results show positive effects on registration as well as sales, but mortgage effect was observed only among women-owned parcels. We also check for the robustness of our study using placebo tests, and then we try to disentangle the policy effect from the titling effect. We clearly see policy affected sell and credit market more than titling in the short time frame. In the long time frame, we observed significant effect in mortgage as well as land markets. We clearly see both policy and titling have effects, not just on the total land market and credit market participation, but also on women, indicating the efficacy of the interventions in terms of women empowerment with property rights. But we also notice, of course, clear differences by type of registration. The magnitude of the effect on credit market and land market participation differs whether the land was registered through a systematic or a sporadic process. So we estimated a simple model using the short panel. The first one is just to see the titling effect on registered parcels as well as registered mortgages and land transactions. And then in the second equation, we try to disentangle policy from titling effect by including the lagged stock of registered land interacted with the policy dummy. But I mean, this model is not without a problem. I think the first one is the usual imbalance in observed characteristics between sporadically titled, or let's call them the control, which are only that where there was no any systematic registration, and the systematic eligible blocks. We clearly see there is some systematic difference. First, systematic blocks were more densely populated and built, but had fewer sporadically registered parcels as well as fewer registered sales and mortgage transactions. So to address this issue, we use propensity score matching using observed characteristics in terms of number of registered parcels, sales, mortgages, share of total and registered built-up area, share of tree and shrub trees area, and as well population density. So I'm not going through into this table, but if you look at the last column, balance is established in all these pre-reform indicators over a period of time. For example, here we reported 1990, 2000, and 2010. There is really good balance between the control and treatment blocks. The other issue is endogeneity, which was mentioned by the first presenter as well. There will be endogeneity between registered parcels as well as participation in sales and mortgage transactions. But to address this issue, we exploit the spatial nature of our data, and we utilize the distance-weighted average of the treatment variable, which is the lagged stock of registered parcels from all the other blocks within the ward. So my neighbor having a title may not affect my demand for credit or my participation in land market. I think we can make that assumption. But the problem is my neighbors, applying for credit or participating in land market may affect my decision to participate in land market. That means basically there might be some spatial dependence. So if this thing is violated, then there will be an issue with the assumption of exclusion restriction. So our instrument may not be valid. But to address or to assess this, we estimate a spatial autoregressive model with alternative bandwidths, 2, 5, and 8 kilometer bands within the ward. So this is just to show you the result. So if you look at the spatial lag, it's only significant in the first two columns, which is the very variable that we are trying to instrument. But for registered sales and registered mortgages, there is no spatial dependence. It gives us confidence in using the spatial IV model in our estimation. So the short panel, this is just a simple regression to see if titling has any effect. you clearly see, there is a significant relationship between titling and registration of parcels. And we clearly see the female effect as well. But I think the key thing is that, as I said, the first two is just to show the effectiveness of the program in terms of female empowerment, as well as increasing the stock of registered parcels. But we clearly see titling appears to have a positive effect in terms of registered sales, as well as but for registered mortgages, as I mentioned earlier, the effect is only on women. Then here we try to disentangle the policy effect. What we did is we included the interaction between the stock of registered parcels and that of the reform dummy. If you look at the elasticity, the blue block, which is the interaction with policy, we clearly see a very significant effect of the lag of registered, number of parcels on registered sales, as well as that of registered mortgages. That means the reform nudges people to participate in land markets or to borrow money. But we clearly see here, once we control for the number of registered parcels and the interaction with the policy dummy, titling dummy, either it is insignificant or appears to have a negative effect on registered sales as well as mortgages. But I think this requires further investigation, and to do that, we use the longer time frame. And what we did is, instead of using dummies, we separated the total registered land into systematic and that of sporadic, and we interact the sporadically registered parcels with the reform dummy. So here, I think we can just compare the systematic registered parcel, the theta 3, with that of the interaction term of the sporadic registered parcels with the reform dummy. If you compare the two coefficients, I think the effect of the sporadic registered parcels interacted with the policy dummy is more than double that of the titling dummy, which implies that the reform has really a much more pronounced effect than that of titling in the case of Montero City. So here we try to see, to compare the Marriage Act with that of the land reform, whether the Marriage Act was enough in terms of empowering women, or whether it requires additional reforms in the land sector. So if you just compare, the first column clearly shows that titling increases significantly, women's access to registered land. For every 10 parcels, more than 8 of them include women as a co-owner, whereas for sporadically registered parcels, for every 10, we will have close to 5 to include women in the title as a co-owner. So we then looked at the sporadically registered parcels, whether the Marriage Act matters or whether the land reform matters. In the second column, when we include the interaction term of the sporadically registered parcels with the post-2006 dummy, we clearly see half of the effect is explained by the Marriage Act. And then in the last column, we separate the policy, the land reform, from the Marriage Act, and we clearly see that the land reform has a stronger effect in terms of empowering women as compared to just the Marriage Act alone. So just to conclude, I think I'll not go through this slide, but the main takeaways are first, for titling to have a significant or an impact on land and credit market participation, it really needs to be complemented by institutional and legal reforms, especially in the areas that enhance or improve the quality and delivery of services, as well as in terms of empowering women empowerment with property rights. And the second takeaway is that the Marriage Act alone is not sufficient in expanding female land ownership. It needs to be again complemented by titling and regulatory reforms. I think finally, as has been as emphasized throughout the conference, collaboration between independent researchers and government agencies is crucial for analyzing administrative data, and in fact, this work, would not have been possible without the generous support of the Lesotho Land Administration Authority, who provides us with an unrestricted access with all the available cadastral and registry data. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Okay, so let me perhaps, I'm not going to try to summarize the whole session, but perhaps raise, 2 or 3 thoughts as I listen to all these presentations. The first regards to data. This is clearly an area which is data intensive and requires quite a bit of efforts, as we have seen global data, longitudinal data, and perhaps just a open question in terms of, how do we bring in even more data? And so some of the more recent satellite data is really, and the recent algorithms on that data gives us an amazing window into use of land, the quality of land, quality of soil, water levels, and humidity in the soil. I'm just thinking, how do we bring these other data into? And these data are actually available for free for researchers. So, some interesting thoughts of how we could do more of that. The second thought that was raised by some of the work is just on how to strengthen the identification strategies in the work to make sure that what we say actually has causal validity. And here, I launched one thought earlier on possibility of looking globally at how irrigation comes in and affects the value of the land. But it could be also by combining the satellite data, which is historical, and we can go back quite a bit, and now it's available at 50 centimeters, which is quite informative, but kind of combining that with perhaps looking at commodity prices, and especially shocks in those commodity prices, to understand short-term changes in the potential valuation of land. And finally, just thinking, and thank you for mentioning rental markets, kind of connecting all this to, and valuation of land, connecting to actual land and labor markets. And so some of the work that we have done at DIME shows that actually, as you increase the opportunities, you also, farmers might actually face serious constraints to adopting irrigation, technologies that are consistent with irrigation technologies because of serious constraints in access to labor, and other constraints regarding the land markets. So rental markets, one idea, but clearly kind of the titling and the thinking about kind of flexibility in those land markets. Looking forward to hearing more. This was a very, very interesting session. And thank you, everyone, and especially the speakers and the organizers. Thank you.